The Idries Shah Foundation podcast. Practical Psychology for Today. Featuring the works of Idries Shah, voiced by David Ault. Welcome to the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. In this edition of the podcast, we will hear selections from Learning How to Learn by Idries Shah. This audio has been made available by the Idries Shah Foundation. Impartiality as a point of view. Question: how do we reach impartiality? Answer: most people's impartiality is not such at all, but a cover for a partial point of view. If you have a bias towards impartiality, your goal must be the control of bias, not the struggle towards impartiality, because you will never reach impartiality through bias. People who believe that they are impartial, however, seldom are. To find impartial people is usually easy only for those who do not need them. As the Anwar-e-Suhaili says, if practice were verification, we would be able to discern liars by their faces. As an example of impartiality, remember the action of Bishr al-Hafi, quoted by Ghazali in his Book of Knowledge, who buried a large number of books, saying, "I feel the urge to recount traditions, but I will not do this until the desire abates." Lack of experience and information causes lack of impartiality, but this does not stop people from believing that they are in fact objective. They believe this because they have a strong desire to be, or appear to be, impartial. Hence Bishr's pointing to the disabling role of the emotion of desire. We can illustrate what people do when they have too little information and too much desire in a safely objective case of an anthropological observation from New Guinea. Buying the President. In April 1966, some islanders refused to pay taxes because they were saving up to buy the President of the United States. They had already refused to vote, as the President's name was not on the ballot paper. To reach an impartial viewpoint, you have to be able to look at situations beyond their immediate message, so that you can eventually see things in the round. If I were asked to illustrate this by a Western parallel, I would choose this tale. Two men in a madhouse. A guide in a certain madhouse was describing two cases to some visiting psychiatrists. In this padded cell, he said, we have a man who went mad when another man married the girl whom he was in love with. And in the next cell? Asked a visitor. In that one, we have the man who actually did marry the girl. Characteristics and purposes of a Sufi group. Question: may we have some characteristics and purposes of a living Sufi group? Answer: appearance may take any form consistent with the culture in which it is operating, the commanding principle being that certain people have to be related in some kind of a viable entity. Objective: to form and maintain, under appropriate guidance, the special conditions in which the teaching can operate. Intention: to enable as many people as possible, in due order, to achieve the understanding which will facilitate the higher, as well as the lower, effects of the teaching to give them maximum developmental help. Program: to keep the group operating as a channel for the successively refined impulses from the source, and to attune the members to be able to perceive these impulses. Characteristics: enough serious-minded but not indoctrinated people, attitudes suitable for the transmission to act upon, an orientation suitable to accept and work with the materials provided or indicated by the representative for the time being of the teaching. Modus operandi: meetings, reading, audition, performances, practices, theoretical and practical study, organization of environment. Deterioration: evidenced by the acceptance of simplifications, contraction of activity, messianic and panacea thinking, hierarchical behavior patterns believed to be sacrosanct, literal acceptance of the figurative and vice versa, hagiography, providing social and psychological stimuli and/or reassurances, offering scope for personality projection, assuaging desires for attention, substituting itself for diversions of a political, organizational, religious, psychological, social, academic, family, and other groupings. Contrast this with the kind of group, that of the man of learning surrounded by others, of whom Al-Thuri says, "Be assured that he is an impostor and a fraud, because if he were to tell them the truth, they would hate him." Prerequisites for a student of Sufism. Question: Can you give me an essential prerequisite for a student of Sufism? I think that it is to be misunderstood. Answer: One essential is that the student should not attempt to impose his own conditions of study or criteria of progress. On understanding, a student should not think that he can understand just because he wants to. 1,000 will call you an unbeliever. On being understood, it was the great Junaid of Baghdad who said, "Nobody attains to the degree of truth until 1,000 sincere people have pronounced him an unbeliever." But the sincerity he is talking about here is not real sincerity, absolute objectivity. It is the sincerity of people who imagine themselves to be sincere because they believe certain things, whether they know these things or not. The sincere act, reflecting the real sincerity, is defined by Abu Yaqub al-Suzi in Kalabadi's Taruf. The really sincere act is the one which is known by no recording angel, by no demon to afflict it, nor by the self to become prideful of it. This means that human beings have to become aware of their essence, the real part of themselves, which speaks when the other elements are silent. The insect. In Fihi ma Fihi, Rumi says that there is a minute insect in a field which cannot be seen at first. But as soon as it makes a sound, people are alerted and see it. People similarly are lost in the field of this world, their surroundings and preoccupations. The human essence within is concealed by all this disturbance. They all look the same. A Chinese restaurant manager, asked in a London court to identify a man who was appealing against sentence for stealing chickens from a Chinese restaurant, said, "All white men look the same to me." What is seen is not always understood in its qualities which may be relevant to a given perception, as with the Chinese and the white man. The Chinese, in Rumi's terms, is lost in the field of his own world. The white man, in the expectation of the court, was in his appearance instrumental, that is to say, identification of his appearance would lead to certain facts. The description, though necessary, was secondary. The student should also regard such things as lectures as instrumental, not descriptive, remembering what Faris relates that Abu Abdullah Shikhthal answered when asked why he did not lecture. Existence is not real, and it is wrong to speak of what is not real. Words cannot be used to describe the real, so why should I speak? The student must be prepared for experience and intakes which do not affect the ordinary consciousness where words and emotions exercise their functions. Although the world is not real, since what we perceive of it depends on our sense perceptions, which may be faulty, trained, or changed, and it is hence not any kind of an absolute, the instrumental function means that it can be employed for teaching purposes. This is why an essential prerequisite, which you ask for, is certainly that this principle should be registered in your mind. As the Sufi Gharib Nawaz puts it, every particle of dust is a cup wherein all the world can be seen. Some things in the world conduce towards understanding, and some towards a greater involvement with the world and consequent lack of perception and false understanding. Parable of the Tree. Sheikh Abdul Qadir of Gilan, in his 27th address of the Futu al-Gaib, invites his hearers to think of good and evil as two fruits from the same tree. Approach the tree itself and become its guard and attendant servant, and acquire knowledge of these two branches and of the two fruits and their neighborhoods, and remain near that branch which yields sweet fruit. Then it will be your food and source of strength, and beware lest you should approach the other branch and eat the fruit thereof, and thus its bitterness should kill you. And when these fruits are brought before you, and the sweet cannot be distinguished from the bitter, and you start eating them, you may put the bitter one in your mouth. In step is out of step. Question: can you say something about the technical use of the term the madman for the Sufi? Answer: there is a Persian saying, to a madman it is enough to shout hu. Diwana ra hu bas ast. The repetition of the syllable hu is a part of Sufi rites. Hence this saying indicates to the intellectualist that you merely shout this word and the well-conditioned disciple starts capering, and capering, as the uninitiated would think, without rhyme or reason. But the Sufi prides himself on being, in the eyes of the uninstructed, a madman, and so he uses the phrase himself to indicate that at a certain stage of initiation, the one syllable, once repeated, is enough to sustain him and produce in him the state which he desires. This brings us straight away to the difficulties of a practice which is inexplicable to one set of people, yet completely lived by another. The books that have been written by Sufis are partial ones. They have to be read at certain times, perhaps in conjunction with certain movements or certain attunements, otherwise their meaning is but fragmentary, like a great deal of other initiatory material which has been taken at face value by outer observers. It is as if a man were to lick the outside of an apple and pronounce it pleasant to the nose, but seemingly devoid of nourishment. Some people may say that they will not seek illumination or otherworldly truths if it involves their capering about. This is like saying that you will drive your car, providing that nobody is allowed to fill the fuel tank. Some say that they want something that they can understand before they will go into it. This is like saying that you will have to drive the train or you will not travel in it at all. It is this outer attitude towards initiatory systems which gives rise to false cults which purport to give you secrets that you can understand, except that they do not, in fact, give you such things at all. If you feel that you can understand a poem, providing that you are given time or peace to absorb it, and will not consider it otherwise, you can be cutting yourself off from a poem which may have been written specifically to be read or recited only under certain circumstances, which themselves may involve a negation of the conditions which you seek to impose. One example is convention, which you have created or copied from someone else. It is not enough to claim that these canons are sacrosanct. They are not, cannot be, and cannot be shown to be. The famous phrase, "C'est magnifique, mais ce n'est pas la guerre," is a typical example of something that should not be, according to the Sufi belief. Indeed, it cannot be. There is an interesting saying involving the use of the technical term madman for Sufi. A fool can easily drop a rock into a well, but 100 scholars may not be able to raise it out again. It may need a Sufi. This saying refers to the difficulty which certain intellectuals, scholars, have in dealing with fixed ideas or psychological problems, a fool. What seems madness to some may be sanity to others, and of course the converse. In this connection, remember the words of Sheikh Abdullah Ansari of Herat. The skilled artisan uses the same iron to make a horseshoe as he does for a polished mirror for the king. 30,000 Americans die each year as a result of taking medicines prescribed by their doctors. 10 times that number need hospital treatment because of the adverse reactions produced by medicines. What may be good for some is certainly not at all good for others. The random application of Sufic and other processes, taken from books or transmitted by shallow imitators, is the madness, not the measured and understood application of real specifics to properly diagnosed conditions. Dye your prayer rug with wine. In one of his best-known poems, the great poet Hafiz says that you should dye your prayer carpet with wine if your teacher tells you to do so. This advice, alarming though it may be to the limited mind of the literalist, is extensively admired by Sufis, and not only for its poetic beauty in the Persian original. Sufis admire this admonition because it is a classical example of multiple meaning, where a precise developmental formula is rendered in several dimensions. Let us look at some of the ingredients separately, which together give the instruction and the content which can only be called a living exercise. 1. Shock. Dye your rug with wine is designed to shock anyone whose faith is based on the conditioning, for example, that wine can only mean something evil. 2. Allegory. Wine stands for an inner experience, similar to mystical rapture in other systems. 3. Obedience. The orders of the teacher are absolute. 4. Occasion. The teacher orders one to do something when it is indicated for one's progress. He does not say, dye your rug constantly, not, until you dye your rug you cannot be a Sufi. He says, when I tell you to dye your rug, dye it. 5. Analogy. Just as the prayer carpet is not prayer, is rather an external thing, so, too, on that level, is wine an external thing, and therefore secondary. Similarly, obedience to the teacher, though taken by the superficial as implying a great sacrifice and high merit, is only of the crude and superficial order in the relationship between master and disciple, as rug is to prayer, and wine is to real mystical experience. 6. Multiplicity of exercises. It is not said that dyeing the rug with wine is the golden key. On the contrary, it is more than hinted that this is just one activity, one part of a measured and known activity which will lead somewhere. This is the most powerful distinguishing sign of this system. To the extent to which the student can learn that he is working within a complex and refined system, and only to that extent, will he be able to move out of crude fanaticism and superficiality. The followers of systems are always looking for, or think that they have found, the single practice, or the only one magic wand, which will give them what they want, illumination or whatever it is. The value of this teaching cannot be overemphasized. It will deter and annoy those who cannot profit from it. It will be utterly useless to those who want to turn the Sufi way into a mere cult. It will show up and make obvious those who are simply copyists or romantics, because they will be unable to benefit from the terms in which we have analyzed it. And all this is contained in a few lines of something which a literary observer imagines is perhaps only lyricism and the poetic outpourings of a man who approves of ecstatogenic processes. Until the real spirit of such technical documents as this is appreciated by the student, we are not dealing with a real student at all. A consumer of poetry, perhaps, a follower, perhaps, a poseur, even, who doesn't know that he is such. But we are not dealing with someone who, in this condition, can progress beyond the exterior. I have actually heard of people who have set themselves up as teachers and who drink wine and ask their disciples to do so in an attempt to follow what Hafiz said. Any comment on such doubly absurd mimetic behavior should not, I believe, be on any higher level than the joke, "What effect did the banana diet have on your wife?" Well, she isn't any thinner, but you should see her climb trees. The Master Dyer. Question. What kind of planning can Sufis do that people are unfamiliar with in current cultural terms? Answer. Try this example. The King and the Sufi. There was once a king who found nobody in his realm wise or great enough to succeed him. So he spent some years in inquiries and study until a possible successor, named Arif el-Arifin, was located. Now the king, perplexed by the problem of how to introduce the wise man in the face of the inevitable inertia, jealousy, and expectations which existed in the absence of a wise man's constant presence and recognition, asked Arif himself to make a plan. Who are the people most notorious in your realm for their envy and inflexibility? Arif asked. The dyers of wool and cloth, said the king. Each one thinks that he is a master dyer and that his techniques and knowledge are the best. These men combine with one another very seldom, and then generally only to oppose the occasional intruder or minor dyer trying to rise in the profession. Very well, said Arif. Cause it to be announced to the dyers that the world's greatest master of their art is coming to take up his abode in your capital city. When the dyers heard the talk of this possibility spread throughout the city, and were shown samples of Arif the master dyer's work, which was magnificent, they went into transports of rage. So bitterly did they begin to hate their unknown rival, that it very soon became obvious to almost everyone else that powerful emotion, not justice or fidelity to their craft, lay behind their vicious, bitter, and often irrational denunciations of the interloper. Now the people of the country in general, whom the dyers had not educated in distinguishing between a good dye, or dyer, and a bad one, heard the attacks, saw the rage, observed the frenzies. Indeed, it was next to impossible for them to avoid these things. And the main effect which the dyers could achieve, though this was of course not what they sought, was to get the name of Arif the demon on every lip. When Arif at last entered the town, the whole population flocked to see him. He lived quietly and with dignity among the people, who were unable to find the treachery, ignorance, and evils which they had been warned against, and consequently began to conclude that they had themselves been deceived about Arif's character. Their acceptance of him and its acceleration were correspondingly great. Their contempt for the dyers was equally complete. People not only began to take all their dyeing to Arif, but, as in all the best tales, he inherited the kingdom as well. Much lip service is paid to the idea that people should not be envious of others, and many people believe that they are not jealous and that they do not oppose others. In fact, the reverse is the case, and much of ordinary life uses envy as its fuel. You may recall the saying that there are 3 things which every individual considers to be attributable only to others. 1, lack of a sense of humor, 2, bad driving, and 3, jealousy. The planning which Sufis do, which is unfamiliar in fact if not in theory in current cultures, is contained in the saying of Dunoon the Egyptian, quoted by Khwaja Gharib Nawaz. Sufis are those who have expunged from their minds the human tendencies of envy and enmity. I cannot forbear from saying, though, that there are many things expressed in current cultural terms which are of the greatest importance to people who want to understand the Sufi way. Some of them may be indicated for people before they can go beyond their present contexts, as you seem to want to do so. Most of the people who want esoteric knowledge do not bother about the basic exoteric senses which come first. In the following tale, the first 2 pieces of advice could have been given to the tense seeker by anyone. He did not need a Sufi. Mistaken identity. A certain seeker after truth rushed into the house which had been pointed out to him as that of an Eastern sage. He grabbed the hand of the figure seated on a prayer rug and begged for advice. I have 3 things to tell you, said the other man. First, you are too excited to understand anything. Second, you are standing on my foot. Third, I am a servant. The sage lives next door. This podcast is copyright 2018, the Idries Shah Foundation.